move money. And usually these are subject to cash transactions. If you look at DRC, they have made a foreign exchange exemption, but there's a threshold of $10,000. You can't carry more than $10,000 cash. But they have also put conditions for onward and inward transactions for the insurance sector, especially in terms of international transfers. In Rwanda, the cash or bearer instrument threshold is Rwandese francs 10 million, which is about $7,000. And then in Tanzania, they have allowed for transferring of profits and dividends from investment, payment of foreign loans, and all other things. But they have also, as I mentioned, removed the requirement for existing banker-customer relationship for trade. Just think of this, what it meant was that for you to get that facility, you needed to show that you have a bank and you are a customer in that bank. Now that has been removed. So you can engage with the bank even if you're not a customer in the bank. But also what's interesting in Tanzania, for those of you who travel too often and stay in hotels, the hotels now are granted a license for the Forex to provide Forex bureau services. Sometimes I would go to Dar es Salaam and I have to go and look for a Forex bureau to change money. Now you can do it in the hotel. They have been given, I think, license fee under the foreign exchange regulations. But in all this, there are restrictions to the free movement of capital. This is understandable, as we'll be noting Article 25 of the Common Market Protocol actually allows partner states to provide restrictions in respect of prudential oversight by regulators, in this case particularly the central banks and the capital markets regulators. And these are mostly been anti-money laundering and countering financing of terrorism regulations. And as you can see from that list, that's what most countries have done, again, because you get gray listed if your measures are not up to notch. So Burundi has a number of them. DRC issued decrees, which they're about close to 6 decrees just on anti-money laundering, setting up various forms of, how can I call it, regulatory bodies. But also there's a central bank instructions. In Kenya, as I mentioned, is that omnibus anti-money laundering and the counter and financing of terrorism amendment law. It's big, it's close to about 70 pages, so you need to read it patiently. And it covers everything from capital markets, insurance, banking, national payments, limited liability, partnerships, even lawyers, and then companies law. And then also Kenya has made amendments to the beneficial ownership requirements for companies and limited liability companies. Rwanda also they've issued a new anti-money laundering law in 2023, and then measures to implement that, as well as administrative sanctions for non-compliance. The central bank has also issued guidelines on the IFRS 9, addressing loan portfolios, investment in securities, and commercial papers and other derivatives. Tanzania, as I mentioned, is an amendments to the laws, or both there are 2 laws which were issued. They tend to issue them separately: anti-money laundering and terrorism regulations, particularly to deal with the designation and sanctions list. They want this updated quickly. So each time the UN issues a list, this needs to be updated so that people are able to make sure that nobody gets through the loophole that the list has not been updated quickly. It has also done beneficial ownership and fit for person assessments in the gaming sector. So those of you who go to Tanzania and want to invest in the gaming sector, you'll be asked to provide beneficial ownership. Who are the beneficial owners of those who are investing in those who are in the gambling and casinos? They've also done BO rule, beneficial ownership rules for trustees. Uganda, we have amended all the beneficial ownership measures we had issued in 2022-2023 on beneficial ownership for that range of, so that now requires a few things we need to do as companies and cooperatives and partnerships in terms of meeting the requirements, the compliance requirements. As you can see, all these seem like they pose a lot of pressures on investors, but that means as an investor you need to continually address these issues when you are investing. But as I pointed out, these are required actually. So partner states are not doing anything wrong. The Common Market Protocol allows them to do that. In terms of services, let me just run through this. Partner states have continued to commit to guaranteeing free movement of services. Of course, usually the usual restrictions. I know EABC had a trading services barometer that was presented recently. So for us, since we're concentrating on 2023-24, so we'll not cover all that they did. But there have been efforts to guarantee free trade in services, but also remember the protocol allows partner states to use tax regulations, tax measures when addressing services. And so they have done that, but they've also included licensing, registration, and other establishment requirements. That's why I'm saying next year we'll probably look at the establishment right in addressing this. So in terms of the modes, mode one is cross-border supply of services. There's a continued adoption of regulatory measures, especially in the digital sector. So you have cross-border supply of digital and electronic services, and this started off with Kenya doing that in 2022. Now you have DRC, you have a cross-border supply of digital services. What has happened is that every country has learned from Kenya. They have now an expansive list of the scope of the services. So even Tanzania, when it amended its digital supply of electronic services regulations for income tax and VAT, they basically expanded that scope. But also what's critical, Tanzania has provisions on supply of architecture services. They've actually, these are one of the omnibus laws that Tanzania keeps doing. It can have a miscellaneous amendments which amend about 20, 30 laws. So sometimes you can miss them. So they have required that if you're a foreign firm who is providing services, architecture services, you are no longer just required to enter into a joint venture with a local firm. You must demonstrate that what you're doing is specifically for knowledge transfer and the capacity building. So those who are architects, if you're planning to do anything out of Tanzania, know you are restricted on the scope what you can do. Commercial presence. Quickly, I'm going to run through this. Banking services, these are usually where what are you required to demonstrate that you are present in the country? So in the DRC, there's sort of requirements of a minimum shareholding of about 15% stake in banks, and that's causing concern that sometimes you might need, how many people do you need to raise that 15% stake? In Rwanda, the insurance services, Rwanda amended reformed this insurance sector. They issued about 6 to 7 regulatory measures in 2023-2024. But one of the critical things there is the requirement for registration, licensing and accreditation, statutory fees, and a representative office of a foreign insurer. In Uganda, we have educational services, there are requirements for registration, licensing, and certain instances, the school board must be approved, especially, I think, secondary, by the Education Ministry. A new law came out at the tail end of our scan, June 28th, the veterinary services law. It requires registration as one of the provisions for presence. If you want to come and set up a veterinary practice in Uganda, you need to register. Unfortunately, the law says the minister will issue regulations. So we'll wait for the regulations on what are the requirements. In Tanzania, insurance services, there's a requirement to register with the regulator, but the registration now is perpetual, so this has been amended. And then also we have audit and accounting services. Commercial presence may be in form of a partnership, but there is a restriction there that the local equity partners constitute 51%, where they are foreign partners. So if you are thinking of doing audit and accounting services in Tanzania, make sure that the local equity holds 51%. That's the local Tanzanians. Temporary presence, just pointing out this, there have been mainly 2 here. Burundi, temporary presence, this is basically where you go and do something for a short time and then you walk out. So you say, I'm going to handle a legal matter in Burundi for that specific matter, and then I'm not staying there. So what Burundi has made amendments to their notary and advocates laws to require provide for temporary presence from EAC partner states. But this is subject to the principle of reciprocity. So that means the other partner states must also accord Burundi the same right of temporary presence. In Uganda, as I've already mentioned, is a veterinary law. There's a temporary entry by foreign veterinary professionals subject to registration and other requirements, usually the academic and the like. Free movement of goods, just to run through these, there have been a mixed bag of tariff barriers. We haven't really gotten time, maybe we'll think of this in the upcoming scans to actually do the NTBs. But just briefly, just based on the laws, DRC, there were several regulations providing temporary restrictions on importation of a wide range of goods from ceramics and all that. Kenya has managed to do customs management of goods in the export processing zone. South Sudan imposed fees. Tanzania imposed an industrial development levy on goods, which was very interesting, but they make an exception for goods, especially these are fruit juices and building construction materials. But what they did was to make an exemption for goods coming out of the East African partner states that meet the EAC rules of origin. So that means you have to be very attentive to whether your goods actually do that. So if you're producing juice and you want to take to Tanzania, you'll face an industrial development levy if you can't prove the rules of origin. There's a common external tariff. Each year, July 1st, the EAC Council of Ministers issue what they call approved measures for import duties in the CET. So they did that. And then for the usually 5 partner states so far, so South Sudan, some DRC are not yet included, including the one for 2024-25. Now, what's interesting there, and this is for why people need to look at these measures, is that there's a stay of application for a year of CET for goods deemed sensitive. And in Uganda, there's a whole batch of goods, from milk to fish to poultry to trade standards. Every country does trade standards. Kenya, Rwanda, Tanzania. Rwanda also has a ministerial order on technical regulations for metrology. It's a very detailed document on how you provide weights and measures, if in the old-fashioned language. And then the overall trend, we keep making standards for specification of goods. They issue this routinely, and those of you who look at the larger scan, you will see that we've listed them. And then we are trying to adopt the EAC standards, even last year, but we're still sometimes stuck with our national standards. Other related cross-cutting issues, corporate governance, you read through that. People are aware that corporate government is critical if you're going to attract capital and investment. DRC and Uganda have addressed that in regulations. EPZs, export processing zones and free zones, the 4 partner states, DRC, Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania, have continued to leverage the use of those export-oriented zones. Competition, the Common Market Protocol requires the partners to prohibit practices that affect trade in terms of competition. Just point out, Kenya, one of the critical things they always do to approve those mergers. But Kenya regulatory competition authority has become so tough on abuse of market and buyer power. So they always issue cease and desist orders. But Uganda, finally, we have a comprehensive Competition Act of 2024. The innovations we've already mentioned, the DRC has a digital code, which is critical for e-commerce, digital platforms, and then I've already mentioned the fintech sandboxes for Tanzania. And so there's a lot that you can digest from that. 182 regulations. We plan for the next scan to address the 1 year, July 2024 that should have been June 2025. And we're already tracking those. But also what we're going to do, as I've indicated, we might not add Somalia, but we'll continue to track the 7 countries. But what we're also going to do is look at the other 3 freedoms: freedom of movement, free movement of labor, and the right of establishment. Because sometimes when you're looking at services, the laws require you to sometimes have the commercial presence, and that's establishment. And that means we'll be looking at things, the land law, what are the changes in the land law, what are the changes in the company's law or the business laws, so that we can then beef that up. So that someone who knows that I'm going to do commercial presence then also knows what are my limitations. Do I need a license, trading license? Do I need to have a lease or rent property? And the like. So thank you very much for your attention. And as we said, we circulate the larger version of the scan to you. Thank you.
Help me give Dr. Noria and the team another round of applause. The amount of hours they spend, lot of hours getting information across and putting it together, is a team that I'm very proud to work with across East Africa. We will move to the next segment, and I'd like to invite our technical team. If you can confirm that Dr. Joy Kategekwa is online. Yeah, let me introduce Dr. Joy Kategekwa, who is going to share her perspectives. Dr. Joy Kategekwa is a renowned trade expert of many years. Many years ago, she was a top student to go to law school. I think there are many top students in the room here. President Isaac Semakade, Dr. Honoria, and Dr. Joy Kategekwa. These ones entered the law school with 4 A's, you know, and they are part of this conversation. So I can confirm to you that we have very top brains this morning to share with us and digest this scan. Online, allow me introduce Dr. Kategekwa. At the moment, she's the Director of Regional Integration, Africa Development Bank. That assignment, she has just taken it up. Previously, she worked with UNDP in New York, but she also worked across Africa in many, many spaces, as well as the WTO. She comes with a new passion to cause integration. She has been given a mandate to work with regional entities, to work with governments, to work with private sector. And this morning we want her to share her perspectives with us on what she sees from the scan and generally about the legal and regulatory measures across. Dr. Joe, you're welcome to speak to us.
To let me do that. For now, they're not letting me do that.
We can now hear you. Can you hear us?
I can hear you loud and clear. I just want to share my video. Your team has to let me share my video so that I can be visible.
Okay.
You cannot start your video because the host has stopped it. This is what I'm getting.
The host is listening in.
But be that as it may, and as they let me get visible, I just want to start by thanking you very much, Francis, for the invitation to engage in this very, very important conversation. I'd also like to take this opportunity to recognize and to acknowledge the presence of Her Excellency Veronica Nduva, Secretary General of the East African Community, and all of the dignitaries in the room. Dr. Honoria, it's a pleasure to listen to you. Like Francis, Dr. Honoria was my professor at the university, at the law school. So very, very insightful, the reflections that you have. I'm still not able to share my video. Francis, is it being worked on? Ah, there we are. There we are. So hello from Abidjan. It's 6 in the morning. I've been up since 5. Really just to share, to be part of the group that's listening to this great insight from the Africa Law Practice and to share my own reflections. So I bring you greetings from the bank, the African Development Bank, where I'm privileged to lead the portfolio that's working around integrating Africa. And I come to this conversation very much with that enthusiasm, that what the Africa Law Practice is trying to do really is to demonstrate how it is, the accountability that is needed for each and every one of us to play a role in integrating Africa. So as I was preparing to come to this conversation, I thought to myself, where do I sit myself in this conversation? And it's interesting because when I logged in the morning, we were right at that moment where we were singing that beautiful song, Afrika Mashariki, you know? And I always ask myself, why is this song so special to me? Emungu naomba wilinde, you know? And I think why it is so special to me, and I hope to you as well, is that because it allows us to locate ourselves as East Africans. It gives me hope about integration. It gives me pride. It gives me a sense of belonging. but it also gives me opportunities as an East African. To the extent that when I present myself to Burundi, to Rwanda, to Tanzania, to Kenya, I can get in there because I'm East African. At the heart of that is a promise to be fulfilled by the partner states that have taken on these obligations, that when you come, we shall honor you with entry that's visa-free. And so I thought in framing my remarks today, I should talk about keeping the promise, because I think what Dr. Honoria has been trying to explain to us through this scan is that countries must keep their promise. There's a host of rules, regulations, administrative processes. These are only useful for integration to the extent that they keep the promise. What is the promise? That when you come, I will honor your presence for visa-free entry. That when your goods come into my jurisdiction, I will give them preferential tariff treatment. And that when your services come, I will not discriminate. I will not maintain regulations in my regime that discriminate against you. And so keeping the promise really and truly is where I find myself most passionate, in the sense that we should all be unsettled about this idea of creating treaties on the one hand, and on the other hand, creating legal regimes, measures, processes that take you back. And so as I was listening to Dr. Honoria, I was thinking this is such a wonderful scan because it gives us the lay of the land in terms of what countries are doing to bring forth that which they have promised. And so in my mind, I thought, are these laws keeping the promise? Are these laws rolling back on promises? Are these laws facilitating intra-East African trade? And so I frame my remarks around this question around keeping the promise. Why is it important to keep the promise? I think that there's two main reasons why that is. And I think all of these two reasons sit squarely in this idea around a promise for economic prosperity. Because when you think about it, as I present myself as a Ugandan lawyer to any of these jurisdictions, what the promise is that I can, if the commitments have been made, we talked about mode 4, temporary presence, that I can present myself and offer my legal services. I can create wealth through that process. And so there's the people and wealth creation perspective. But there's also this idea that when your goods come into my jurisdiction, I will not discriminate against them. And so what does that tell you as a producer? That tells you that if you add value to your production, if you get into the industrial process, there is a market in all of these 7 countries that are the subject of this scan. And this is hugely important because we also know that we're talking about economies that have typically struggled with this idea that their integration into the global production chains is at the level of producing, supplying raw materials. What the promise is in the East African community is that when you add value to the extent that the products are not on the so-called sensitive list, we shall not impose additional tariffs. And so it's a signal for industrialization. It's a signal to make in Uganda for the East African market. And that's extremely important. The second piece why the economic prosperity is critical through East Africa, the East African community and its integration, is really that through the East African community, you can pitch from there and tee off into the One Africa market. So this idea around the building blocks, that through the experience in the East African community with production, with value addition, with meeting standards and so on and so forth, we can build up the capabilities to position for the African continental free trade area. Think about the number of people. I mean, they talk about by 2040, we'll have 2.5 billion people in Africa. In Africa, think about that size of the market. Think about the promise of the AFCFTA, that what we have tried to experiment with here in the ESC goes to huge scale when it comes to the continental level. And so I really would like for us to see it in that way, that the pathway towards economic prosperity is really hinged on whether these regulations that we have seen in the scan are facilitating integration, facilitating production, or rolling back. Now, I'd like then to say that the whole idea about this promise we're talking about can be meaningful if you get ready to produce. Put differently, it can be something to spectate at if you're not ready to give something to the market. And therefore, this idea around investment in the capabilities to bring something to market is critical. And that is why the work of the African Development Bank is extremely critical, because the African Development Bank is at the heart, the largest investor, I believe, in Africa's integration. Whether you're talking about infrastructure, whether you're talking about trade finance, whether you're talking about building productive capacities, and so on and so forth. And so if you think about the infrastructure of trade, for example, you know the Standard Gauge Railway, the bank has been behind financing this $3.9 billion investment, putting to the disposal of the countries involved $700 million. I was in East Africa recently and I had the opportunity to meet the Secretary General, and I went through Kenya all the way to Namanga and then into Arusha. And I was so proud at that one-stop border post, looking at what is improving as facilitation, thanks to some investments from the bank. And one can think about much, much, much more in terms of investment. But let's go to production. And I'm saying that it is extremely important for Africa's enterprise to get ready to invest and build up their productive capacity. This is why issues like trade finance become critical. I was looking at the numbers. The East African community is accounting for about 40% of the bank's investments in Africa in infrastructure. 64% of that is in transport and increasing amounts in trade finance. The point and the message is you have to position for production to bring something to market. And so let me close off by saying, well, why does this matter to you and how do you get involved? And there I go back to where I started, which is to really praise Francis and your team, Africa Law Practice, for leading the way in the type of work that the legal fraternity can do to bring to account this idea that you must keep your promise. And so I invite you to do more. I invite you to keep accountability. I invite you to demand accountability, to keep the pulse, the hand on the pulse, to ensure that these promises that have been made are not rolled back. Maybe thanks to you, we shall start to see a reduced sensitivity. Maybe thanks to you, we shall start to see a rollback in this idea that on the one hand, we say there's free movement of persons. On the other hand, legal fraternities in different countries are lobbying to keep the other lawyers out. Maybe thanks to you, we shall start to see that this report that the bank produces, which is the Africa Visa Openness Index, starts to tell a better story about the fact that Africans are moving rather than being kept out by visa regimes. So all of this to say, you have your hand on the money, you're doing exactly the kind of work that needs to be done. Spread it also into the production side. And let's seize the opportunity, not just in Jumia, but also in the rest of Africa. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Kategekwa, for very, very wonderful insights. And indeed, it is a call to do more. And all of us must be challenged this morning to do more. And how much more can we do? We will have a brief 10 to 15 minute panel at most, full of which will be constituted by people who have done business across the region, policy makers, legislators. And without further ado, I'm going to ask the panelists to come and take their seats. Ambassador Stephen Kaboyo, who is going to discuss with us the aspects of capital markets. And he comes with a lot of experience, former director at Bank of Uganda, but also the head of Alpha Capital. He writes routinely on capital matters in the newspapers and makes commentary, and we see him routinely on our TVs. Let me ask my friend, Honorable George Odong, who is an MP of Iala. He will share briefly what the Iala Parliament will be, how it will receive this report and what more can be done. George Odongo is known to many of you, a very seasoned professional who has now a foot in the East African Legislative Assembly, masters in trade, understands the subject of trade, and has a very vast network across the region. Let me also ask Mr. Julius Chaze, co-founder of Swang's Avenue. Julius has this interesting ambition to be in 52 countries. And he has moved He has the experience. He's just not doing it in theory. Many times when we travel, we meet him in the airport, either going or returning. But you all know Julius. He runs a very interesting and very, very successful company called Swangs Avenue, and he's doing a lot of business in the region. So let me ask one of our colleagues, Juliet Aboto, to come and just share one or two questions, and then the SG will launch the report and we'll be out of here at 10. So Judith is an associate with us at LP, but at LP we believe in generational leadership. You see, she's representing generation, but very competent, Chevening scholar, returned recently from her studies, and she's going to moderate the eminent panel. Thank you. Judith, over to you.
Thank you so much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. So we want to have a particular discussion between the public and the private sector. And why we think this is a pertinent discussion is because at ALP, as a cross-border law firm, we believe that EAC integration is the future, and that for the prosperity of the East African community, all countries within the East African region have to find a way to harmonize their standards and to commit to the regulatory commitments that have been done or made by the different EAC partner states so that business can thrive. And when businesses thrive, the economy thrives. And when the economy thrives, the different EAC partner states thrive. And then there is prosperity for all. So with this conversation that we're going to be having this morning, it's going to be trying to understand colleagues from the private sector, trying to understand colleagues from the public sector, that would be Honorable Jojo Dongo, and to help us understand how the East African Legislative Assembly is, trying to progress the EAC agenda, and also to see from the private sector the challenges that they're facing and understanding from them their opinions on how we can do better for the EAC integration. So my first question, I think, would go to Mr. Julius Chaze, who is my neighbor right now. As a person in the creative sector, and you are not just a normal person, but you are a seasoned entrepreneur in the creative sector. You've not only worked in Uganda, you've worked in Tanzania and I believe Zambia as well, and in various other countries. What are the key challenges in your sector that you're facing with regards to the different regulatory and legal policies that have been made that are challenging you in the creative sector, that you would want the East African community to address?
Thank you very much, and thank you for having me. You could tell even from the previous conversations, there's not enough mention of what we do in terms of the creative sector. A lot of people relate to the creative sector when, say, you mention musicians or artists, but it's actually broader than that. It's way broader than that. I lately tell people what we do is as essential as oxygen. It's innovation. And now we're in a generation of, everyone is talking about Gen Zs and their madness and their craziness because they believe they have the ability to create and innovate. Now, we can easily write that off as being not as important or not as serious, but this is the only way we can innovate, around problems. So the people that are creative and innovative and come off like unusual, come off like they're confused, like they don't know what they're doing, just because we cannot understand their thought process or where they're coming from. So we get sidelined half the time. And this is going to include your children as well, because you won't understand them, they won't understand you, but then you want them to play by the same rule book that everyone plays to, and then you lose each other. So this is exactly happening because most young people want to play in our sector. They feel they are creative, they feel there are innovative ways to do things, but then the people that are doing the regulations are not paying attention to that divide. I'll give an example. Right now, if anyone has been following the American elections, the most viewed platforms right now is not CNN, is not NBC, It's actually podcasters. Like PBD, there's this guy, Patrick Davids, I think he has about 200,000 live viewers right now. And these are disruptors. So this is the ability that the creative sector has to not just disrupt the status quo, but to innovate and create so much employment for young people, because they're all striving to get to that. But is the law catching up with that? No, it's not. I moved to several African countries. I'm forced to have a residence in Ghana, a residence in Tanzania, a residence everywhere you go, and it just doesn't make sense because then I won't do business. So we seem not to even have access to our own continent. And when you hear these conversations, we see the non-serious guys. But actually, I think the creative industry is one of the most essential as medical, because it's through this madness that we'll be able to innovate. So we need to bring it to the forefront and have those conversations in the legal conversation, so we can be captured in the legal framework as we integrate the region. So the politicians have wanted to integrate the region. And when we don't know how, we all know how well that has gone. We think we can do that through art, through the creative sector. But we don't even have enough alignment legally, for instance. We don't have enough lawyers that understand what we do. We are in the middle of a transaction that could facilitate our scale out on the continent, but the lawyers on either side have delayed this transaction because they have to get educated about what we do. And yesterday I was in a meeting, I was like, guys, if you're going to learn what we do and be able to facilitate this transaction, we might not close until 2026. So that's one of the challenges. And this being a legal audience, I'll cap it at that, but there's so many issues that you find while trying to do business in the region.
Thank you so much, Julius. What I take from your discussion is that it's not only a problem of access, but it's also a problem of understanding the creative sector.
Yes.
So I think we should take note of the fact that with regard to the freedom of movement of services within the East African community, the creative sector has been neglected, and people should strive to understand
I'll give you a quick insight. But when you look at some of the creatives that have won globally, from Uganda, for instance, look at Eddie Kenzo, or even the ones that are winning locally in Uganda, Winnie Nwaji, whatever, some of our artists, and you ask them, how many shows have you been at or performed at in East Africa or in Africa the last 10 years? Burna Boy in 2023 performed 3 times on the African continent, but performed over 50 times in Europe and the US. So artists are performing more further west, and we are leaving money on the table. So are we saying there's not enough money, on the youngest continent, that there are not enough opportunities in our region? We like to call it the Swahili nation, this entire East African bloc. Almost, I think we're going to hit about 300 million people in terms of population. So that makes us what? That makes us, I think, number 1 economy on the continent. But what are we doing about that? So the opportunity is right there, and we're not doing enough even from a legal standpoint to come and support the sector that could potentially employ the biggest chunk of unemployed youth in this region.
Yes, we need to leverage the opportunities that the East African community integration has provided for the creative sector. But before that, I would like to get to the freedom of movement of capital, and I would like to invite Mr. Stephen Kaboyo to share with us what you find the greatest challenges with the movement of capital within the region. Are we up there? Have we reached 100%? Are we on 80%? Or are we in the negatives?
Thank you very much, Judith. Allow me first to thank the ALP team for this important scan. I think this is the second round of scans that we are seeing. I'll begin by just a few comments on the scan. It is an improvement from the last one that we saw with respect to the legal frameworks that support capital markets development. So there is quite an improvement, but at the same time, it identifies very huge gaps in terms of standardization, having common practices. You find one country flying way above at a different altitude, others are way below. And the crux of the matter here is in capital markets, you need to standardize rules and regulations. You need to have a level playing field. And more importantly, critical mass. We need to gain critical mass. I'll quickly go on a country-to-country comparison. When you look at the capital markets landscape in the region, each country has focused more on developing their domestic markets. Of course, for different reasons, sovereign reasons, but again also as economies transform and grow, you'll find that we have now 4 stock exchanges in the region. I was reading a report where Burundi also wants to start a stock exchange with 1 listing sometime in 2025. So really, we are so focused on domestic, and we've lost our focus on the regional stage. If we are talking about East African integration, of course there are other things. Monetary union, which calls for currency convergence, is off track. IAMU had said about 10 years, I think they expired. We do not know where that is, because that is the cement that puts together everything that we are talking about here. Common currency, common monetary policy, common fiscal convergence, that seems to have lost track. Now, we can move with the legal frameworks, but in the markets, you'll find that markets come before legal frameworks. Legal frameworks follow markets. Now, we seem to have, what is the saying? The cart before the horse. But it's good, whatever it is. But for me, I want to really focus on bringing policymakers, honorable members of parliament in the region to really push the agenda that we have done a lot at the domestic level. Let us focus at the regional stage. Let me quickly, I know we don't have too much time. If you look at the infrastructure deficit funding in the region, annually, it's in excess of about 15 billion. We have been running to China to look for money to come and develop our infrastructure. Clearly, 15 billion is present in this regional market, if you put it together. If we had the framework to be able to mobilize that capital within our region, through issuance of a regional infrastructure bond, that bond will be successful. It will address our needs, and we do not want to, we'll avoid running to China or going to Washington to beg. But also begging now has become a problem. China is fatigued. The World Bank and IMF has conditionalities. Our debt levels are out of the roof. We may not be able to access international credit like we used to. So developing our own base at the regional level is, I think, a very, very important stage. Now that the legal frameworks that support this are in place, falling in place through the good works of groups like ALP. The other issue, of course, is we also need to look at diversification in terms of what do we have in the capital market space in terms of diversity of products, diversity of investors. You'll see that the major players today on the institutional base are mostly pension funds. We can develop more institutional base presence with diversification products that are available in the markets. So we have fallen short, but it's not too late. We can still recapture the reform process in terms of moving towards a regional stage. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Mr. Stephen Kaboya. What I take from you is that while we are progressing, each country has its own standard And so there is an aspect of harmonization that's lacking so that we can progress at the same level and at the same pace. So I want to move to Honorable George Odongo, who is the chair of the Uganda chapter IALA. And I would like to get your perspective on, yesterday you mentioned at the EABC Secretary General CEO breakfast, you said that the private sector should reclaim EAC integration from the politics that had taken over the space. So how do you think the private sector should reclaim that? What advice would you give them to reclaim the EAC integration process? And not just that, but to work and collaborate with politicians and the people who make the policies that can help them do better in business.
Thank you very much. The EAC is positioned as private sector driven and people centered, meaning that the private sector has to play an essential role in driving the integration agenda. Unfortunately, I think over the years, we are celebrating 25 years of EAC. We have outsourced the integration agenda to politicians and bureaucrats. There's a lot of boardroom decisions on matters of regional integration, and that is not how it should be. So my point is that private sector, number one, is the one that finances our integration because they are the biggest taxpayers. And the rationale behind our integration is one, to ensure that we facilitate trade and use trade as a catalyst for driving social, political, and economic integration. So the private sector needs to take its space, and the private sector is structured in many ways. That's why I'm happy with the work that the ALP is doing, because even our function as an assembly, our function of legislation, oversight, representation is largely informed by knowledge. It's very knowledge intensive. So you can only have an intelligent conversation on the basis of knowledge. The assumption we have outside here is that, members of parliament know everything. They actually do not know as much. And some of these areas are very specialized. So the private sector needs to intensify engagement to narrow the gap between the politics and the private. In any case, legislation is not an end in itself. We legislate. We have a raft of legislations. We have so many policies in place. We have sufficient, if I may say, legislative infrastructure. But you see, the role of implementation is that of our partner states. The role of implementation is that of our partner states. And if you look at the EAC, you'll see that we are at different levels of integration, essentially because state institutions are at varying levels of competencies in our partner states. So you're going to find countries like South Sudan are still, grappling with building the state institutions as much as they are even grappling with building in nation building. The same goes to probably DRC and the others. So you'll see that the level of integration varies depending on the institutions of the state that are mandated to implement some of these legislations. So what does the private sector have to do? You have got to put pressure on your national governments to see that they are aligned to the agenda of regional integration. Don't leave that to politicians, because with us in the politics, we are in a revolving door. We come in and come out. The banks call us politically exposed people, a polite way of saying you are temporarily a banker. So really my point is that we need to build that critical mass of private sector players in the different segments: service sector, goods and services, transport. You know, all the private sector players, you have got to come together and begin to drive this integration agenda. That's why I said yesterday that you need to reclaim that space. That space has been taken over by short-term, aspirations of those who are going knowing that I'll be there for 5 years or 10 years. But this is a long-term investment in the future of our children and so on. So we need to be interested. We need to activate that sense of urgency, as private sector players, in order to reclaim that space that has been taken over by bureaucracy and also by the politics.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Honorable George Odong. A wise man yesterday stated, Mr. Simon Kahura, I believe, he stated that we need to have a grid, our own grid for the East African community. And from what you've stated is that the private sector itself needs to have its own grid for the East African community, not wait for other players from international spaces or outside Africa to have a grid for it, but let's have a grid for our own selves for the East African community. And also in line with what Mr. Stephen Kaboyo said, that, we have the capital within if we just organize ourselves within the East African community. Let's not wait for international funders to come. Let's have our own grid for the community. So as a parting shot, I'm going to go through each and every one sector from where they come, from wherever they're operating, and ask what is that one change that you think can be implemented or can be suggested or can be proposed to leverage opportunities within the East African community. So it could be within the creative sector, it could be within the business sector or the private sector generally, or the public sector from the policy space. But what's one thing in your opinion that you think that if we did this, we would do better as an East African community? I'll start with Julius.
For me, the biggest, I think, pressure point or blocker that I think should be a no-brainer, that we should all be pushing towards, is why do we still need passports to go to Tanzania? Like, it just doesn't make sense. Why do we need passports to go to an East African country? Can't we harmonize that systems in their way? Like, it just doesn't make sense. Like, if you ask me that for that one thing, like, give us that, maybe we'll sort ourselves with the other things. And if that can also come through on the capital channels, if it can come through, because it's still difficult sometimes to even pay stuff across, because then you have different withholding tax exposure issues, and the rates are not as consistent, and also there's not enough information. You find a lawyer in one market, they'll tell you you need, say, to put in $200,000 in this market to come in as a foreign investor. That might not apply to East Africa, maybe. I'm not sure if it does to many countries. But then they misguide you. This has happened to me twice, I think, before. So then they do a back channel. The lawyers do a back channel of, no, let's use the local partner to hold majority of the equity. And then once we get the paperwork out of the way, then we'll do the transfers. But I've gotten ripped off twice in doing that. And then you find that the money they wanted, you've lost more than what you would have actually put on the table and got in. So why is it that complicated to do business in East Africa? We've seen what Uganda Airlines has done. It's one flight to Dar, one and a half hours, 45 minutes to Nairobi, one flight to Kinshasa. So, but we see a lot of us that has opened opportunities. Now imagine if we take out the border, control restrictions. I think that will be a big changer for us.
Very, very, very well thought. So, thank you so much, Honorable George.
We have 4 pillars to our integration. That is the customs union, common market protocol, and then we have the monetary union, and we are going for political federation, the ambition of which has been transitioned through political confederation right now. But I think, in my view, that to drive our integration agenda, if we can leverage on the opportunity that the customs union and the common market protocol, it will eventually allow these ones to fall in place automatically. Because once we have an effective customs union and we have an effective common market, you know, the heavyweight lifting here that we are not doing is actually to say that our borders mean nothing. The idea of sovereignty in a regional bloc that has ambitions of political federation, I think is a no-brainer in my view. So having some of these regulations around our borders is unnecessary, because it's the one that is, you know, slowing our speed of integration. If we could only remove these sovereign borders as EAC and allow people to just move and experience the EAC in trade, social integration, and so on and so forth, you are going to drive this. That's why yesterday you heard me saying that, you know, we are stuck in the technicalities around our borders. And that is making even flights between our partner states very expensive, because they are categorized as international flights. Our space can be domesticated so that you fly from Uganda to Tanzania as a domestic flight. Why do you call it an international flight when you are operating a customs, a common market? You can't say you are in a common market and then your flight to Tanzania, to Kenya, is categorized as an international flight. So some of those are the low-hanging fruits. Unfortunately, they have become high-hanging fruits in the recent past. But we can change the trajectory of our integration if we only dealt with those two very critical elements of our integration.
Thank you so much. Mr. Stephen Kaboyo?
Yes, thank you very much. I think for me, mine is simple. We need to shift the conversation of capital markets development to the regional stage. We have done a lot on the domestic level. Let's go to the regional stage and block the potential barriers and ensure that the regional capital markets develops in the next coming years.
Okay.
Thanks.
Thank you so much. And not just even in the capital market space, but in all aspects of the different 6 freedoms that the Common Market Protocol gives. So I would like to thank my these honorable panelists that have had this conversation with me. And I would like to thank the audience. But to conclude, as a key takeaway from this discussion, is that we need to leverage the opportunities that the Common Market Protocol gives, and that is what we are doing at ALP East Africa. By doing the scan each and every year, is that we're trying to make sure and remind the partner states of their commitments under the Common Market Protocol. Thank you so much.
Doing very well on time. A round of applause to the eminent panel. Because we want to manage time, everyone in this room is a VVIP, so I'm not going to recognize you by name, because our commitment is to respect the promise that we end just at 10. And to do that, I will just recognize just the center table seated with the Secretary General. Already the Honorable George Odongo has been introduced. Next to the Secretary General on her left is Honorable Tim Luanga. Honorable Tim Luanga does not need a lot of introduction. He's a senior citizen, and he serves as the Senior Presidential Advisor on EAC. So some of our thoughts here, we are sure will be taken where they should be shared. And then we also have the Senior Technical Advisor to the Judiciary, Professor Hauha, who also has to have this conversation with the Judiciary in deployment of these laws. And of course, President Isaac Semakade, the Law Society, has a cardinal role in leading a conversation, and she's come along with a technocrat, Mebo, who is supporting the Law Society in causing these conversations. But here we have various leaders, industry leaders. We have representatives from embassies, key embassies, Kenya. We have PSFU in the house. We have the Vice, Sarah. Welcome. We have EABC, Mr. Kaheru, who will come in later to just move a vote of thanks and close us. But for now, let me ask Honorable George Odongo to come and do what I am not able to do in terms of protocol, to invite the Secretary General of EAC. Last year, the first scan was launched by EAC. We thank the East African community for always, especially at the highest office, for always making time for these scans. They shared some insights which improved the second version, but we also know that the Secretary General will share further insights that will lead to a better version next time. So Honorable George Odongo, please come and do the needful and invite Mheshimiwa to speak to us. And then after that, we will have a launch and we'll have a photo opportunity, and then Mr. Kaheru will just move a vote of thanks on our behalf to thank the Secretary General and indeed all of you for being part of this. So Honorable George, you're welcome.
The Right Honorable Secretary General, and all of you distinguished participants this morning, I'm always very happy to introduce my Secretary General. She has been with us for less than a half a year. But you know, in the Western practice, they assess leaders after 100 days. And we have done our own internal assessment of our Secretary General. And I can tell you that she has passed with flying colors. I have no comment about the previous ones. But the Right Honorable Nduva comes with a wealth of experience, having served in the government of Kenya and the top executive for over 24 years as a principal secretary, who in our case here is at the rank of permanent secretary. She has also worked with the American government, so she has insights on who is going to win today's elections. She may tell us way before we even know. But yes, the Right Honorable Nduva has brought in a new dynamic to the Secretariat, and within a very short time has activated some of the silent voices that really are supposed to be the key drivers of our integration. And we are very proud of our work. This morning, my role is only to introduce and invite the Right Honorable Secretary General. The Right Honorable Secretary General is a graduate from University of Nairobi, with a bachelor's in communications and a master's in public administration. And she has also attended several universities. She will come here and speak for herself, but I can assure you that she's a very well-grounded public servant and has been very much involved at strategic levels in the government of Kenya. With these very few words, I invite the Right Honorable Secretary General to address the participants.
Thank you so much, Honorable Odongo, for your kind words and kind introduction. I will make a few edits in the interest of nowadays people do fact-checking. I actually graduated from the University of Nairobi in political science for my undergraduate in political science and public administration, and I mastered in political communication. I also worked with Kenyan government. I think my entire career experience is the one that's about 25 years combined, having been PS in Kenya from 2022 under the Ruto administration, and very grateful upon his conferring to me the opportunity to serve as Secretary General. So thank you so much. Allow me to congratulate in a very big way the ALP East Africa. First of all, I like your branding as a communication professional also. It's very impressive, very well stated. But also for the mandate you have across. I wondered why Uganda and then all the way to Ghana. But then at least I saw you're also in Nairobi and in the region. So congratulations on that. Allow me, before I make my official remarks, to also, if you may allow, weigh in on the conversation as was presented by Professor here. Thank you for the good insights. I always enjoy academic work, and I was happy to listen in to this study. Now, I wanted to reflect on some of the issues you brought under the capital, the movement of capital, and I think you touched on it, and happy to see Dr. Joy online because she knows this is something I've been passionate about. I think the issue of payment systems needs to be discussed whenever you're looking at the capital, movement of capital, especially because of the challenges that are there. We have not yet managed to come up with a regional switch because we don't have a lot of the countries with national switches, and therefore retail payments become a challenge across board. And if we are going to trade, because you talked about trade at the border level, then how are we moving capital when we don't have a currency convergence? So I think for me, having an insight into that and conversations around that is very, very critical. And actually assessing in your scan the efforts that countries are making towards moving towards regional switches, because honestly, it doesn't matter how much progress you make at national level if it is not converging. Then we will not achieve movement of goods, services, people. And this exposes the community to a high cost of doing business, because as I guess if I were to use an example of the ALP, if you're going to pay your staff across the region, then chances are that you use SWIFT, and SWIFT transfers are expensive. You pay, for instance, $55 per transaction. And we need to grow the East African payment system that is charging $4 per transaction. And therefore assessing the usage of the EAPS is critical at that level of movement of currency. But then at the retail level, the movement towards a regional switch, by ensuring that we have at least single national switches that can converge and are interoperable. I think to me that will go a long way, because our currencies do not recognize each other. You go with the South Sudan pound to Burundi to be almost a piece of paper, because it's there, yes, but what do I do with it, you know? And you are aware that our currencies converge around the dollar, and we are now in a situation where the issue of dollarization is become a political question on its availability and its movement. So that's one. And it's quite something that for us to move to EAMU, I've had one of the panelists, I believe Ambassador, talk about EAMU and whether we've realized it or not. We need to get a few checks in place before we move to EAMU, and that's why we've moved the needle a little bit to 2030. I don't know if it's still realizable with the state of play. You also talked about the around capital movement. You also talked about the AML and Terrorist Financing Act, and I think I wanted to mention that don't forget that at least 3 of the major economies within the EAC are grey listed and therefore are impacted in a big way, and the others that are not grey listed are basically not grey listed because they either don't have stable economies or because are not very matured in terms of governance structures. But that's something to factor in this study as you scan. In terms of movement of persons, and I know this has been quite central to the heart of the lawyers especially, it's about the mutual recognition of professional services and just mutual recognition agreements. So I think I would input by saying that can we assess how much partner states are moving? That would be helpful to me as a secretariat. How much are partner states moving towards ratifying and applying mutual recognition of professional services, so that the brilliant minds I've had here, you know, when you're in a meeting and words like chevening and what were professors' universities apart from Makerere? Cambridge. Then you realize you're in a room full of scholars, you know. And of course, we can never forget Makerere. And for those of you who know about Kenyan parlance, we say the University of Nairobi, with emphasis. But what I'm basically saying is that Uganda is really has great professionals in the legal space, well recognized, well celebrated, and playing very high at the global stage. So this mutual recognition is in the interest of everyone in the community and specifically for me. The skills gap require, and I think that came out yesterday in the CEO's roundtable, that the skill gaps also is a great basis of assessing the need for mutual recognition, such that we are able to provide skill sets across the board. Then in terms of movement of goods, is a whole issue of harmonization of, even under movement of persons, harmonization of tax regimes becomes a very, very big challenge. So there is need to analyze how much progress are we making towards that. Yes, we've made a lot of progress towards harmonization of fiscal policies, the fact that our budgets get read on time, in the same time, the fact that we have a common approach to CETs, and but still harmonization of tax regime is the elephant in the room. Now on CET and the high stays, funny story, yesterday in Odongo, you were there, Mheshimiwa, I talked about Uganda having the highest number of stays of applications within the EAC, and then there were claps around the room. And I said, well, that's not necessarily a good thing, you know? So it depends on the lens that you're looking at it from. If the lens is from national protectionism, then maybe it will be a good thing. But if the lens is integration, then a high number of stays is not a good thing. And therefore, for me, my recommendation to ALP in this scan is the need to include an analysis or an assessment of the progress made in removal or review of stays. Because frankly, I think there are stays which could already be removed from the books. Either they've self-resolved or they've been overtaken by events. But the fact that we have countries like Uganda leading with 900 plus stays, Kenya with 800 plus stays, then integration and talking about CMP becomes in flux. Yeah, so I want to, I've made a comment on YAMU. So I think I want to congratulate the team for the work that has been done, and perhaps as a way of actioning it and moving it forward, make a recommendation that the findings of the study. I'm just trying to switch on my gadget here for my remarks. Yeah, the findings from the study, my suggestion is, could you convey formally proposals to the Secretariat to look into, and be able to follow up on, because then you're holding us to account on some of this. But great job and a very impressive piece, and I look forward to interacting with the more wider part of the study. So allow me to just make a few remarks in the interest of time. So Dr. Joy Kategekwa, Director, Regional Integration Coordination Office of the AFDB, good to see you again. And I see you are staying true to the cause of the African outfit, forwards ever. Dr. Henry Honoria, Knowledge Partner, ALP East Africa. Mr. Francis Gimara, Head of ALP East Africa. Professor Kauka. And Honorable Tim Rwanga and Isaac, the President, and all of VIPs here, feel VIP'd, distinguished delegates, invited guests, ladies and gentlemen. I am honored to be here today at the launch of the second annual East African Community Common Market Capital Services and Goods Scan 2023-2024 by ALP East Africa. I extend my appreciation to ALP East Africa for publishing this report that tracks the progress made on the 3 freedoms enshrined in the Common Market Protocol that was signed by the Summit of EAC Heads of State on 20th November 2009, and which is being implemented by partner states. The Common Market Protocol is not just an economic agenda, it is a vision for a more connected, competitive, and prosperous East African community. It envisions a region where goods, services, capital, and people flow freely across borders. I have a personal term I've come up with. In a nutshell, integration should be just termed with one word: borderless. Just that. Thank you. I view this CSG scan as complementary to the East African Community Common Market Scorecard, which is a continuous monitoring tool on the implementation of partner states' commitments in the EAC Common Market Protocol. The scorecards have spurred commitments from the partner states to address existing restrictions, gaps, and barriers, and there has been substantive progress in undertaking reforms. The scorecards enable us to track progress, achievements, and challenges in the implementation of the CMP and to suggest solutions in collaboration with stakeholders. This scan complements the community's determination to monitor and assess the progress towards a fully fledged common market. It is through such deliberate and regular evaluation that we gather invaluable insights that highlight our achievements, identify areas for improvement, and guide us towards our collective goals. As you launch this report, I wish to note that the community continues to record significant progress in all the 4 pillars of integration, namely the Customs Union, the Common Market Protocol, and the Monetary Union Protocol, as well as the Political Federation. It is now my pleasure, before I launch that, it is my pleasure first to comment on the creatives. I forgot he said was very passionate on the creatives. And while, yes, the CMP does not explicitly mention the creatives are catered for in every sense, from intellectual property, protection to movement of goods. But yes, it has come to our attention that there is need to have specific focus on the creatives. And perhaps to Honorable Odongo, the reason I will not comment on the US election is encased in law, and I invite you to look up the Hatch Act. It is now my pleasure to launch the ESC Common Market Capital Services and Goods Scan 2023-2024. Thank you.
Okay, we'll move a bit behind here. Move the... So, Honorable Secretary General, the act of signing is the act of launch. So we have the honor to invite you to officially launch the scan 2023-2024. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah. So we will now take photos with the copies here. You can come up, all of this. I'm going to invite as well Mr. Kaboyo to come up and the representative of Kenya High Commission. Do we have the other industry heads from Kasita to just come for a photo opportunity? Dr. Honoria. We will move a bit. The Secretary General in the middle. Yes. Okay. You all need copies of this. And just wait for me as well. So you may take our seats and just ask Mr. Kaheru to give a vote of thanks to the Secretary General and indeed to all of us for being part of this. So I think just to appreciation.
Yes. Good morning, everybody. You can see the excitement is still rolling through. And I'm sure you're all excited because of what's going to come next. Not just today, but in the weeks, months, and years to come. And as Honorable George Odongo said, what we are looking forward to is long term. Ladies and gentlemen, my simple role this morning is to deliver a vote of thanks. And I should start by thanking the organizers. The organizers, please give them a round of applause for putting together such a great event, but very specifically for choosing a representative of the private sector to deliver this vote of thanks. Because I'm standing here representing the East African Business Council, which we know is the umbrella organization for the private sector across East Africa. But in the room, I have colleagues, CASITA, PSFU, the Uganda National Chamber of Commerce, Uganda Bankers Association, and other private sector representatives who are appropriately placed today because we are the channel of the benefits that are supposed to go to the people of East Africa from integration. And that's why it's important for us to be here at this point, up on stage on the podium, and in basking in the intellectual prowess of many of the people who have been here. So a few of us from today are going to say, I spoke on the same day as Dr. Cambridge, now I should call him, using the same microphone. And I was in the presence of Dr. Kategekwa, and so on and so forth. But even more importantly, we must thank ALP East Africa and congratulate them. We thank you for doing the heavy lifting, because we know this is not an easy task. We also know this is not your task. You did this voluntarily. But your heavy lifting is more important because you've taken leadership by not just talking the talk, but by walking it. Spreading out to the rest of East Africa as a homegrown practice deserves a round of applause. Crossing from East Africa to another region even deserves a standing ovation. ALP East Africa, well done, well done, well done. And I know that the other legal practices in East Africa, and Uganda specifically, are paying keen attention. Hence the presence of our radical president of the Uganda Law Society here today, who we believe is going to encourage the rest of the profession to follow your lead, because other service industry, other service sector players have already done so, as Mr. Chaze has exhibited. But ALP East Africa, your noble aspiration of generating knowledge and Pan-Africanism is laudable in very many ways. And I'm sure today you've achieved your objective of kicking off a conversation that all of us in East Africa, each and every one of us in this region, needs to take up and carry through every single day and to take into the rest of Africa. But also now, on your behalf, ALP East Africa partners, and I join you for the next 2 minutes, even though you don't need to pay me for being a partner, I will thank all the participants today. Those who are in the room and online, thank you for giving us your hours this morning to carry out this very important event, to enjoy the sumptuous breakfast off the wide buffet, but even more importantly, the intellectual breakfast that we have enjoyed. This has been fantastic. Please, thank you very much. And it has been even more fantastic because of our panelists and our keynote speaker, Dr. Joy Kategekwa. We know it's early in the morning for you, but being a PhD, you always wake up very early, so we give you kudos for dialing in and ensuring that we see your face this early morning, but hear your wise words. And panelists, thank you for, in so short a period of time, cutting through these issues, in such a nimble-minded manner. It was just superb to go through the issues from four different sectors actually, because Honorable Dongo covered a couple, and enabling us to understand and ride with this. And many of us, like I said, are going to come out of this room even more intellectual than before. For the rest of today, I'm going to sound very clever out there because I'm going to be repeating the words of these panelists. So I thank you for making us all more impressive. And what's even more important for the goal of regional integration and Pan-Africanism is that whereas this highly intellectual conversation has happened over here, we know that we need it to be absorbed, especially by our partners in the public sector, the government of Uganda. And we are happy that we have representatives from the government of Uganda here. We know and trust that going by the very stature of these representatives, the message will land. Honorable Tim Lwanga, Special Presidential Advisor in EAC Affairs, is definitely well attuned to this task. And we know he will convey the message extremely well as a deep-seated Pan-African and champion of regional integration. And Honorable Lwanga, we thank you for giving us all this time and attention, and we trust that you are going to go and advise His Excellency the President extremely well, as you always do. But we know it's a difficult task for you because you're a reverend preaching to the Archbishop of Regional Integration. However, in that difficult task, you have the right partners to work with, because here in this room, we believe in working together. And that has been exhibited very, very well by Honorable George Odongo from the East African Legislative Assembly, who I have known since we were little children, doing things that are not normally spoken of on the microphone, therefore I will not divulge, but who has stayed true to his very nature, all his beliefs, and is not a politician, as you heard here this morning, but a leader, a Pan-Africanist, a mobilizer, and one who believes in doing what is right for what is right. And it is on that note, Honorable Dongo, that we wish to thank you and request that you pass these words of thanks on to the rest of IALA. Because we have full faith that you're going to stay the course long term, as you've said. And that even as you go ahead through those revolving doors of Arusha, you may come out, but the battle will run on. And we will be here to run that battle on with you. And the reason we believe that this battle is going to be won is because of what we consider a blessing across East Africa today, our brand new Secretary General at the EAC Secretariat. Ladies and gentlemen, her energy, her excitement you have felt for the last so many months. I can't even say there are many months. Honorable Dongo was surprising me when he mentioned 100 days, because we feel it's just been a burst of a few weeks, but the most influential weeks for us in East Africa so far. And we know that this is only a beginning. Your Excellency, you have established yourself as a lead champion of East African community integration, but a champion of the private sector. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm sure you've all noticed through all the media reports and from your interactions with her, this lady has spent more time with us, the private sector, than with the politicians. That is rare, that is strange, and it is fantastic. It is because of that that we know Tutashinda. Who can stop East African community integration with a leader like this, with a joint force like ours? Madam Secretary General, please maintain that energy and continue being the embodiment of the premise and promise of Wimbo wa Jumuiya Africa. Specifically, and you may sing along, tufanye kazi sote kwa makini, tujitoe kwa hali na mali, tuijenge jumuiya bora. Asante sana, nashukuru sana. Thank you, sir.
So much, Mr. Kaheru, for a very wonderful vote of thanks, and he has covered everyone. What we are going to do is to close with the national anthems in reverse order, beginning with the EAC one, the East African anthem, and the national one, and then we will yes. So we would like to say that we have not acknowledged every East African community member on the background, and we apologize for that. I think our people still have the old artwork, but East Africa is bigger than that, and we will improve on that. So asante sana. I would like to say that I think Honorable Tim Lwanga, as I escort the SG, you and the other VIPs, please ensure you sign on that board before you leave, and me and Remo Jojo Dongo will escort the Secretary General. let's be upstanding for ESC anthem. And the online audience, thank you so much for being part of this, and indeed, God bless all of you for supporting LP in this very wonderful venture. Asante sana.
Mungu twaomba unilinde Jumuiya Afrika Mashariki, tuwezeshe kuishi kwa amani, tutimize na malengo yetu. Jumuiya yetu sote tuilinde, tuajibike, tuimarike. Umoja wetu ni nguzo yetu, idumu jumuiya yetu.